To stream. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to an ALEC TV live stream. Sorry about that little technical glitch there at the top. I'm Catherine Mortensen with ALEC Public Affairs, and joining me here on my left is Lee Schock. He's our Vice President of Policy, and on my right is Joe Trotter. He's our Task Force Director on Agriculture, Environment, and Energy. And we're really excited today. We have two special guests we'll bring on in just a moment, but we just want to set up our live stream for today. We're talking about America's conservation heroes. And if your Facebook feed is anything like mine, you have tons of friends posting pictures of their family vacations. They're all headed to our national parks. They're out camping. It seems everyone's favorite activity this summer is to get outdoors. And we know America has some of the most pristine wildlife in the world. And the question we're going to talk about today is, how do we fund that? Who's paying to preserve and conserve all the great parks and wildlife all over the country? So that's the topic of conversation. And I will bring in our two guests right now, and you will be really excited to know who we have today. So we have Marco Leva. He is the Managing Director of Public Affairs at the National Shooting Sports Foundation. And if you're not familiar with that organization, Mark's going to explain to us all about NSSF. Welcome, Mark. And then Mia Anston. She is the ultimate outdoors woman. She's from southwestern Colorado. She and I have been friends for a number of years, and she's fabulous. So we're going to be really excited to hear from her about the hunting and the great American traditions of outdoors, and who, again, is funding all of the land preservation in our country. So welcome to everyone. And I think, Joe or Lee, you had the first question. You wanted to get started talking about how we fund all this.
Well, just a couple comments, I think, to go off of your opening remarks, Kat. And I know Joe can give us some context of why this is such a timely conversation. But like you mentioned, a lot of Americans don't realize what is paying or how a lot of our wildlife and conservation efforts are being funded. And so one of the things we want to talk about today is an excise tax at the federal level, the Pittman-Robertson Excise Tax, which is a tax on firearms, ammunition, and archery equipment. And since it was implemented by FDR in the 30s, it has raised over $15 billion to go towards those efforts. And so we'd like to talk a little bit more about that today. But Joe, maybe talk a little bit about why this is so timely.
So there are a couple of reasons, but one interesting part, it is a federal excise tax, but the vast majority of the money does wind up being handed down to the states for them to implement their own conservation programs. But actually earlier today in the House of Representatives, they passed a update to the law that's would, if enacted into law, would take about 15% of those proceeds to go directly towards helping essentially endangered or threatened species. So it's particularly timely that we're having this conversation today.
Mark, why don't you give us more of a background on NSSF and your organization's role in promoting the outdoors and preserving lands and all of this?
Yeah, thanks, Kat. I appreciate y'all having me on today. So the National Shooting Sports Foundation is the firearm industry trade association. We represent your manufacturers, your ranges, your retailers, all the way down to your mom and pop shops, some endemic media, your outdoor riders. We represent their interests. We're a trade association like any other trade association. It just happens to be our product is firearms and ammunition. So, we have our hand in this space, especially with conservation, because of the excise tax that's paid by manufacturers straight to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. It's paid down to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to be able to pay for some of these conservation projects that we all get to enjoy, whether you hunt or not.
And Mia, what is your background? Tell us a little bit. I mean, I've heard your story and I love it. You grew up in a small cabin at the end of a dirt road in the rural Colorado. Tell us about your background and your relationship with the great outdoors.
Sure. And thank you all for having me on with you as well. And this is a great topic. And it's one that I actually teach. I'm a volunteer hunter education instructor. And as you said, I encourage people to get outdoors. And part of that is because in my teen years, I was kind of pulled out of that dirt road and thrown into the middle of metro area in San Diego. So being moved around like that, I realized just what you're saying is that a lot of people didn't realize they didn't know about hunting and fishing and money that comes in to help them have habitat and wildlife to view and stuff like that.
Well, I am a big fan of hunting myself. A little bit more on background. The Pittman-Robertson Act was passed in 1937, and it may be hard to believe today, but before the North American model of conservation came along, seeing a white-tailed deer was just a rare sight. So, Mark, could you tell us a little more about how things have changed in terms of hunting and game populations?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate the opportunities. So when the tax came about in 1937, when it was enacted, wildlife populations were at kind of a critical low in the United States. And that was due to a lot of market hunting, due to a lot of population. There wasn't strong regulations that were in place for the management of wildlife in the United States. And some forward-thinking members of Congress, as well as the industry, were able to work together to make sure that we were investing in perpetuating wildlife for future generations. So if we look at the population of wildlife in the United States at that time, we had, roughly maybe about 500,000 white-tailed deer that were still in the United States. Ducks were at critical lows. Turkey were less than 100,000. Pronghorn antelope were really low. And since we've been able to invest in recovery of these animals, and that includes recovery of their habitat, making sure that we have strong management programs, making sure that we're doing the longitudinal studies to make sure that we understand what they need for propagation and reproduction. Those have birth now what we enjoy out in the wildlife today. So we see that wildlife is teeming. There are maybe in some parts of the country an overpopulation of deer, and we need to make sure that we have a good management strategy on that. But Rocky Mountain elk have come back. We've seen wild turkeys have come back across the entire United States, with the exception of maybe a couple of states where they were not native to begin with. And so we've seen that, we've been able to enjoy that. But I think what's also important to understand is that it hasn't just benefited wildlife species that we hunt, not just game species, but also non-game species. So we talk about the habitat conservation and wildlife conservation. That's also benefited animals like the bald eagle. The American bald eagle was listed as endangered in the 1960s and 70s, and now they've been removed off of the endangered species list and the threatened species list. They're teeming all over the place. So bald eagles are doing very, very well, and obviously that's a species of raptor that we don't hunt, but it's vitally important to make sure that we have that species in the wildlife habitat to be able to have that healthy balance and make sure that we can all enjoy the wildlife species that are out there.
So basically what you're saying is every time somebody buys a firearm or an archery set, or I believe even fishing gear too, they're helping to protect the great outdoors?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So the excise tax is paid by the manufacturer. Every time a firearm is produced, every time they make a roll marking and put a number on a gun, every time they seal up a box of ammunition, that manufacturer is paying that excise tax to the U.S. government. That tax, of course, is passed down along to you and I as the consumer of that. So when we pay for that firearm, or we pay for that ammunition, we're supporting those manufacturers who are paying the tax. And over the past couple of years, with the explosive growth of gun ownership in America, we've just seen an exponential increase of the number of dollars that are going into this program. So again, we talked about earlier, you said that $15 billion is where we're topped out about right now with the contributions to the Pittman-Robertson Excise taxes. But it's important to understand that we contributed over $1 billion in less than a year alone. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was able to apportion out over $1.1 billion that was directly attributed to firearms and ammunition, and that was going back to the states to help fund the conservation projects. And that's everything from access to these properties, opening up land bridges to isolated areas, to improving habitat, and ensuring that we're having these studies that are going on to make sure that we understand what's happening with our wildlife and how to make sure we're making the necessary adjustments to our management models.
Well, Mark, one of the things you mentioned, and I'm sort of thinking of this from like a tax policy perspective, and one of the things you mentioned is that it's paid by manufacturers, but it gets passed on to the consumers of the products. And I actually think that's a great point. That's something we talk about a lot. It's that businesses aren't the ones paying taxes at the end of the day. It's people who pay taxes. But one of the criticisms that you might hear sometimes is that it's not just hunters who are purchasing these products, but hunters maybe are the main beneficiaries. What would you say to something like that, that you might hear frequently? Mark or Mia would be interested to hear your response.
I'm going to take a quick stab at it, and I'll turn it over for your perspective. I'd say from the industry's perspective, we're very proud to be paying this tax and perpetuating wildlife. We're very proud that we could have a seat at the table and be able to have a voice and how wildlife is accessed by the American public. And that's the bottom line, is our wildlife belongs to you and I. It doesn't belong to, a land baron like was the old European model. This is something that belongs to everybody. It should be enjoyed. So whether you are out there hunting these animals so you can put food on your table, or you're just out there observing and want to enjoy wildlife, these animals and this wildlife and these areas, public lands, belong to all of us. And we're very proud that we can have a part in perpetuating that for the future.
Yep. And I would definitely echo Mark's sentiment there. Everywhere you go, you'll run into gun owners who are not hunters that are actually very proud to support the cause for the North American model of wildlife conservation. And basically that's what the Pittman-Robertson Fund funds, that model of conservation. So we're managing the habitat and the number of animals that are on it. And it's even more important now. We've got a mass exodus of people leaving some states and coming to others right now. And habitat is dwindling. So we need the work done on the land more than ever to make good lands for all the animals. And this money really helps out. As far as being a hunter, Kat mentioned that I'm a guide, and when I'm out there, I really try to teach people about that and in hunter education classes. And the money comes from Pittman-Robertson to help me do hunter ed classes. And so it's just something that overall it's helping the habitat for everyone to enjoy. We also have a record number of recreationists. I live in Colorado, and a big concern on the Springs Ramble here in Colorado, and a big concern is the number of people that are out there right now. So the recreationists, mountain bikers, hikers, and various others, they're starting to become concerned as well, because we have dwindling elk populations here. And so they're kind of learning about what the fund is, and there's some ideas about other ways to bring money to support habitat.
Can I just ask a question, Mia? Because you said something about more and more people are out mountain biking in these nature trails. And Lee, would this make sense from a tax perspective? Maybe we impose an excise tax on mountain bikes or dirt bikes. I don't know. I mean, would they want to share in the conservation efforts?
Well, and that's something, I was just on a roundtable this last week, and the person that represents the mountain bikers said the vast majority of them are not interested in that. They don't think they have an impact on the wildlife. So it's a matter of us educating them. And there are studies that Colorado Parks and Wildlife is working on to kind of show the impacts and what is happening. So hopefully we can educate them in the future. And there's also been talk of amending Pittman-Robertson. I mean, if we added archery on there and maybe add something like mountain bikes on there as well. So we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I think something that, I'd be interested in seeing, of course, we've got our principles of taxation at ALEC, that, good taxes should be simple, they should be applied fairly, they should be, the revenue should be used for core functions of government. One of the other principles, though, is transparency. And so, when you're making these purchases, because it is paid at the manufacturer level, you may not know that that's kind of built into the price. The transparency, I think, is really important. But also one of the things that comes to mind is like gasoline taxes, right? So gas taxes, we think about them as paying for roads, but sometimes they can be used for other purposes, which is, a reason that we have a model policy at ALEC to say that there should be a constitutional amendment that says those funds should be dedicated to highway projects. I think with Pittman, there is a risk. I know we saw in like the Clinton-Gore years, there was an investigation because a whistleblower said that some of these funds were being wasted or used for other purposes. And so I do think it's important to have some guardrails there. But at the end of the day, the benefits have been great. It's such a worthy cause, as you've touched on, Joe.
Yeah, and over the years, there have been some amendments to it. And there's one in particular, and it's generally been reviewed favorably. But a couple of years ago, it was amended to include basically, in the original act, the money was not allowed to be used to basically promote hunting or target shooting. And I believe it was a 2019 or 2020 piece of legislation changed that so that states could go ahead and advertise for hunting, advertise for public shooting ranges and such. But to me, it always kind of seemed like that was getting away from the core function of actually applying this money directly to helping the environment. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so you actually bring up a really good point. A couple of years ago, NSSF worked with Congress, and we got the Target Practice Marksmanship Training Support Act. That's a really long way of saying the range bill that changed the formula that states could access PR dollars to build new ranges or improve existing ranges, make them either larger or make them safer for shooting. So it used to be that states would have to come up with 25% of the fund. So if you had, let's just use really round numbers, say it was $1 million project, they would have to come up with $250,000 to be able to access the other $750,000 to have that project. Well, that can be difficult, especially when you're talking about state DNR budgets. So we were able to work with Congress to change that formula to 90% and 10% match. So 10% from the state and 90% they could pull out of the PR funds to build ranges or improve ranges. And so that way you could have a safe place to go shoot. And the reasoning behind that, why we pushed for that, was we understand that up to 75% of the funds that are going into the Pittman-Robertson funds are coming from recreational shooters. These are people who may never go into the woods, may never go into the marshes and hunt animals, but they want to shoot recreationally. And so those tax dollars are benefiting wildlife. And if we can get more people into the shooting sports and do it in a safe place, and our surveys indicated that if someone can get to a good range within about a half hour's drive of their home, they're going to shoot more often. So if they shoot more often, they're spending more money, putting more taxes into the program, which is going to be perpetuating itself forward. And like Mia said, she's out there teaching hunter education courses, and that's part of those funds are going to hunter education courses to be able to fund those programs so we can grow the next generation of hunters. So we've had some improvements along the act along the way, which include people who may never hunt but do enjoy the recreational shooting sports, and we want to make sure that their voices are included in this as well.
So where are states getting those other 10% of the funds?
So a lot of those states they're coming from state DNR budgets, which can be also generated from the sales of hunting license, fishing licenses, state stamps. If you're going to buy a duck stamp, you have to have your federal stamp, but you just have a state stamp. So some of all those are helping to generate the state funds that are able to perpetuate those programs as well.
And if I could ask you, if you can add, did you want to add on to add that? Because then I have another question for you.
I was going to say through the legislature in some states, they've also allocated some of their general funds to help their DNRs.
So my question, Mia, for you is, are we seeing a resurgence in the interest in our outdoors activities, archery, hunting, fishing? Are we seeing a new generation come on and more parents wanting to get out there with their kids?
It's a great question, and it varies a little bit. Right now, the number of people who are purchasing hunting licenses, they're showing that it's on a decline. And that's partly why we need to promote hunting, is because that Pittman-Robertson money is allocated based on the number of paid hunting licenses. So we have to keep that cycle moving, and that way the state can get the money to work on the projects that they have. So it's on the downside right now, but also in the past 2 years, we've seen an increase of people who not only have purchased firearms, but they're interested in more of a locavore movement to procure their own food nearby. And so that's on the rise. People want to eat more healthy. They're concerned about processed or synthetic foods and things like that. So we've kind of got some things changing, and I think it's going to show more what's happening in the next couple of years.
Awesome. Well,
do you have any final questions, Lee or Joe?
No, I think it's been a really informative discussion. I know I've learned a lot from you two already. Of course, like I mentioned, my wish list here is more transparency and simplicity always. But I am a huge fan of getting outside in our national parks and enjoying the beautiful country that we have. And so to the extent that we can continue to preserve that for our children and the next generations, we've got to keep working together to do that.
Well, is there anything else you guys would like to add?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. Again, the industry is very proud of the work we've been able to do, and we're proud of people like Mia, who are out there, doing honestly God's work every day to try and grow this next generation of outdoorsmen and women who are going to be invested, who will understand the value of having wildlife and to be able to enjoy that for the resource it is, whether that's to enjoy it, to see it teeming in the countryside, or to be able to bring it to our tables and enjoy a clean source of food. It is really something that's unique to America, and it really does require each of us to be invested in safeguarding that for the future. So thanks for everyone who's invested in that.
Well, thank you. And so, Joe, you asked any last comments before we say goodbye? Mia, did you get in?
I was going to say that just to let your audience know that if you are a new gun owner and you're looking to learn about just safety and shooting, stop by a hunter education class and you'll learn about conservation as well as safety.
And find some good mentors too.
And I will say one more thing, Mia. I mean, this is probably you and maybe Mark. My husband, to this day, he carries around in his wallet his little hunter safety card that he got when he was about 10 years old. Like, that is one of his proudest things. And when I first met him, I was like, what? Why are you carrying this around? And it was just like so valuable to him. And he grew up in that generation where that's just what was expected of young boys. And I don't know that we see that so much anymore.
Yeah, that's something else that I could probably add to your list there is, since hunter education has been enacted in Colorado, we've seen a 90% reduction in fatal incidents with firearms. And so we went from 10 total down to now we say near 1, and it's near 1 because we're human and we'll never be perfect.
Wait, so what you're saying, say that one more time. Colorado has seen a reduction in fatal
fatal incidents during hunting. We've seen a 90% reduction in the incidents. So since we started firearm safety and hunter safety, that number of incidents during hunting has greatly diminished. So the education definitely makes people more safe.
Right. And the Pittman-Robertson money, a lot of it does go towards education, the hunter safety training. Yeah. Well, thank you really so much to both of you. It's so good to see you both and hear from you and learn about this Pittman-Robertson Excise Tax and how we're funding our conservation efforts. And I call all of you my conservation heroes. So thank you. And we will see you next time on an ALEC TV live stream.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.